For this webinar, what we want to do is focus on what very quickly emerged as a key question arising from US regulation, and that is whether or not the legal regulation of cannabis is delivering on what many advocates have seen as its most important promise, which is that of addressing, in part, the historical injustices caused by the war on drugs, and of establishing a more equitable future for those people and communities who've long been the target or the primary target of drug law enforcement. Now, that issue has obviously taken on a renewed urgency this week following the murder of George Floyd. Now, that murder has not only led to widespread outpourings of anger, but it has further exposed the deep and profound systems of racial oppression that operate across all levels of social and political structures. And in the light of that, I'm sure that that's going to be a frame for today's discussion. We're going to be wanting to consider questions such as, what is the role of drug policy in reinforcing and facilitating the policing problems that we face? And what might be the role of reform in, at the very least, reducing some of those structural opportunities for racial oppression of that sort to be operationalised? I think that's one of the questions we might want to touch on. How can we seek to ensure that the focus of drug policy reform and drug policy advocacy is the promotion of social and racial justice? What can we learn from those states that have tried to build social justice and equity into programs in their regulation from the start? How can we take that forward? We also want to think about lessons for other countries that are looking towards regulation, including hopefully the UK, and to think about what similarities there are in regards to the intersection of drug policy and social injustice in those countries outside of the US, such as the very high rates of imprisonment amongst Black people in the UK, for example. I think terrible as the situation is in America right now, it shouldn't actually lead anyone to the conclusion that similar problems are not occurring in other countries too. We need to be looking at this as an issue and a structural issue across all our societies and thinking about the role of drug policy reform in that. So to do that today, we're joined by a really incredible panel, and everyone at Transform is really grateful they've taken the time to make this webinar happen. Our panel are, we have Shaleen Title, who's an attorney who currently serves as a commissioner on the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. And her work is very much, as I'm sure many of you know, focused on establishing systems for promoting social equity under legal regulation. We've got Kassandra Frederique, who's Managing Director at Drug Policy Alliance, who again, many of you will know from her long campaigning on these issues. And we have Dr. Kojo Koram, who's a lecturer in law at Birkbeck, University of London. Kojo, again, many of you will know, but he's also editor of The War on Drugs and the Global Colour Line, which was published by Pluto Books last year, and has been doing a lot of work around this issue recently. So the way this webinar is now going to work is that my colleague Harvey Slade, who is the main author on this report, will start by briefly presenting some of the report's observations on the issues of social equity and justice. We'll then go to each of our panelists to speak for 5 to 10 minutes each, after which we'll open it up to a debate using questions from the Q&A chat. The webinar will last about 1 hour, so not a lot of time, so I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to take a back seat from now on and hand over to the rest of the panel. First of whom will be Harvey, who is going to share his screen, so if you could get ready for that, and he'll give you a presentation of some of those findings from the report. So with no further ado, Harvey, if you would like to take over. Thank you.
Hi, James. Yes, so as James said, my name's Harvey. I work at Transform as Research and Policy Officer, and I authored this report. So the report itself focuses on cannabis regulation across the United States and the states that have legalized cannabis for non-medical purposes, but particularly, and the purposes of this presentation, is going to focus on the key findings in relation to how states have sought to facilitate social justice and equity through cannabis regulation. Okay, so why is cannabis about social justice? There's lots of motivations to regulate cannabis, whether it's to protect public health, to accrue tax revenue, to promote personal liberties. Why should states think about social justice? And the answer really is quite simple. So cannabis law enforcement under prohibition has had hugely disproportionate impacts on poor and marginalized communities, and particularly Black communities. Prohibition has been a tool for the mass criminalization and incarceration of communities. So for many advocates, regulation is meant to address this. It's meant to acknowledge and begin to repair historic harms. But of course, these aren't just historic harms. There are lasting, ongoing harms that outlive prohibition. Even when cannabis is legal, states have hundreds of thousands of people with criminal records for activities now legally authorized by the state, which provide lifelong stigma and continue to restrict economic, employment, and life opportunities. States have to seriously think about how to respond to this. And alongside this, states have a lucrative new industry, which offers a great deal of opportunity for some people to make money, and for states themselves to gain revenue through taxation. But without intervention in this new industry, it risks continuing and entrenching the same inequalities that were experienced under prohibition. So if we accept that regulation is an opportunity to promote social justice, then the question is, how do we ensure that it, A, helps make reparations for the harms of prohibition, and B, helps ensure an equitable spread of the benefits going forward? So across US states, our report outlines that social justice and equity is facilitated in two primary ways through cannabis law reform. Now, that's not to say there aren't other ways, and that's certainly not to say that we don't need much more wide-scale reform to promote these values. But this is focusing on expungement, meaning the deletion of a criminal record, and social equity programs. So expunging criminal records for historic cannabis offences means the record is removed from existence and you can legitimately say you never committed the crime. And this is of symbolic importance, the state acknowledging its past wrongs and lifting the lifelong burden of criminal records, but as well as practical importance to open up opportunities for the individual from which they will have previously been practically barred. However, as you can see from this table, many states don't offer expungement, they offer criminal record sealing. Now, in many cases, these individuals who have their records sealed rather than expunged can still rightfully claim that they never committed a particular offence. But unlike expungement, where the record is deleted, destroyed, removed from existence, if the record is sealed, it is still in existence, it's just hidden. And in fact, it's still problematic as these records can still be revealed by some more detailed checks. So the stigma of criminalisation is not entirely lifted. Unhelpfully, record sealing and expungement are regularly conflated despite this practical difference. It's clear that expungement is preferable, but of course, record sealing is better than nothing. Now, another important factor is how states allow access to these procedures. If individuals themselves are required to apply for expungement, then they may be deterred by court filing fees, queues, administrative processes, a lack of knowledge of procedures, or even potential re-traumatization at having to visit the courts where they are potentially sentenced. Now, this is a real problem. Of 10,000 potentially eligible individuals in Denver, only 176 applications have been received by April 2019, for instance. The fact is that more people are likely to benefit if record sealing or expungement is automatic, meaning the onus is not on the individual to clear their name, but on the state. And this is what's done in California, for instance, where the onus in law is on the district attorney to find eligible criminal records by July 2020 and seal them. And this is also symbolically important. It's the state justice system that caused the harm, and it's the state justice system taking the first steps to redress that harm. Expungement is therefore ideal, and automatic expungement is the gold standard. Now, if expungement is focused on removing historic harms, then social equity programs are focused on sharing the benefits of the cannabis market going forward and to ensure access to people disproportionately impacted by prohibition. The cannabis market is worth a lot of money, meaning many people will benefit, but without proactive intervention, market forces with no inherent sympathy for social justice will prevail. Through regulation, there's the unique opportunity to ensure that this benefit is shared fairly and not simply gobbled up by large and largely white corporates. This enables states to ensure that the new system, regulation, doesn't simply recreate the inequalities of the old system, prohibition. So social equity programs are focused on benefiting people disproportionately impacted by cannabis law enforcement under prohibition. But how do you define this group? And this is something that's made more difficult in the US as it's unconstitutional to define this simply by reference to race. Our report outlines that states have therefore sought to define who has experienced disproportionate impact under prohibition in two key ways. It's defined at an individual level by including individuals who were directly harmed under previous cannabis laws, for instance, people who receive convictions, But the harms of prohibition impacted entire communities. So most states have additionally sought to provide access in their social equity programs to people who live in disproportionately impacted areas. Now, what's a disproportionately impacted area? Again, it's something that's measured in different ways. Some states have focused on areas defined as low income, which is something that Colorado's done, because poorer areas are more likely to have been disproportionately impacted. Illinois requires the area to be low income, but also requires the area to have experienced high levels of arrest, which is a more direct measure of harm. But this is all still imperfect, and one of the best methods that's been conducted so far is by the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission, which went into much more detail and commissioned research which investigated and ranked the impact of drug arrests on communities through a range of measures. From this, it was able to determine the areas most impacted by law enforcement under cannabis prohibition, and therefore which areas should qualify for its social equity program. And this is also really valuable for regulators going forward to develop a more comprehensive understanding of how prohibition has harmed their communities. So what benefits can these individuals get, and how can you assist them? Well, you can't produce or sell cannabis without a license. This means that states can, if they want, ensure these licenses and the potential benefits they bring are spread equitably, including among people disproportionately impacted through social equity schemes. States have sought to provide access for disproportionately impacted groups in different ways. So you've got things like priority access schemes introduced in Massachusetts, which allowed for equity license applications to be processed first before the bulk of applications. You've got diversity points like in Nevada and Illinois, where a certain amount of points on a license application are available for status as a social equity applicant or for business diversity. Now, this is still problematic because in Nevada, for instance, they also score applicants on whether they've run a business previously, which if you've been disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition, you may have not, owing to legal or financial barriers. Another important way to widen access to disproportionately impacted groups is by removing financial barriers. Illinois, for instance, offers access to a low interest loan scheme, as well as 50% license fee reductions for equity applicants. This is especially important because disproportionately impacted individuals are much less likely to be able to meet the initial regulatory costs of funding a new business. But all of these things just help facilitate initial access to the industry. How do you ensure that access is meaningful? Well, this is something that's been attempted by Massachusetts, which operates a program which includes training, technical assistance, and mentoring to equity applicants, meaning that involvement in the industry, if desired, can be lasting. There is an overarching question at the bottom of this, which is, are these benefits that we're seeking to provide really sufficient to facilitate the goals we want to achieve, namely social justice and equity? Do we need something much more fundamental in order to make any real inroads? So in terms of measuring success, it's very early stages in many places, so it's difficult to measure the success of social justice and equity efforts. Some states offer no social equity programs at all. In fact, clauses in Alaska and Maine, which have no schemes at present, actually prohibit people who have committed certain prior drug offences from working in the industry, meaning that they are doing more to prevent people who have been disproportionately impacted from getting involved than they are to help them. Washington has also been criticised for its lack of diversity. It has detailed new proposals to boost diversity in the industry, but what it can do is actually extremely limited because it's already handed out all its licenses. And this actually highlights the importance of hardwiring principles of equity and social justice from the outset, which is something that Massachusetts attempted by where legislation actually requires the Cannabis Control Commission to ensure the meaningful participation of disproportionately impacted communities. Introducing social justice and equity at the legislative stage ensures that facilitating this can be a duty of state regulators rather than something that may be intended at first but ignored later on. Another reason it's important to establish this from the outset is that market dynamics will establish themselves very quickly, and large corporates will entrench the market at great speed otherwise. These are new markets, and that's a unique opportunity. So this is just a brief summary of the findings of our report in relation to social justice and equity, but the report does cover regulation much more broadly. The full report will be on our website just after this webinar. A companion report has also been prepared by our partners in Mexico, MECD, and here's where you can find some of those reports. So I'll stop sharing my screen now because I'm sure you're all desperate to hear some discussion from our great panelists.
Great, thank you so much, Harvey. I'm just going to make sure I've cancelled your spotlight video. There you go, so we can take you out. Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's very helpful. So what I'd like to do now is go straight over to our panel to get different views on this general issue. If I could start actually with Kassandra, if I could go to you first to maybe give us a kind of your take on the bigger picture and the issues that you think we need to be thinking about right now, and what we need to be thinking about as advocates possibly going forward. So if I could go to you, Kassandra, to speak first, that would be great. Thank you.
So good morning and good afternoon to the folks that are watching. I think we just have to start where we are, and where I am is sitting in New York, which has been devastated by COVID-19, as well as our streets are on fire based on the racial terror that has been something that we have known for a very long time here, but is ever present with the killings of people like Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Tony McDade. So I just want to situate ourselves in where I'm sitting and how I'm reacting, and having a conversation about cannabis regulation and social equity and social justice. I think it's really important. This conversation, I struggled with how relevant this conversation was for right now, and if I wanted to speak to it. But I think it's pretty important, considering that social justice is what propelled legalization to actually be viable in the United States. It was the conversation about people being disproportionately impacted by police arrests and police violence that really incited the imagination of people to see and reach for an alternative towards regulation. And what is very clear, and it is super important to recognize, is that legalization and regulation of cannabis has not fulfilled its need for social justice. And while we're having a conversation about regulation, it's important for us to actually understand that the social equity that we need, the social justice that we need, is to actually fulfill the promise of removing cannabis as being a tool that can be used for racial terror. And right now, as it stands, it does not. And in the conversation of regulation, that also goes to the policies that we put forward that leave people that remain in the unregulated market to be criminalized. And we know that to be the case because we've seen the ways that regulations create more space for companies and law enforcement to continue to kill us through people like Eric Garner, who was allegedly selling loose cigarettes, an industry that is regulated in the United States, but that was used as a reason to kill someone. And that has not been fully addressed. And so it's important for us to recognize that when we're having conversations about social justice and cannabis regulation, that if the regulation does not actually deal with the full scope of the racial terror that can happen through law enforcement, then I don't actually give a fuck about licenses, right? Because we don't actually have a license to live. And if we're not actually having the fullness of the conversation about what we're trying to make cannabis regulation give us license for, then we're actually not having a conversation about social justice, and that diversity and inclusion and forwarding licenses is not actually what is necessary. Recognizing that right now in the United States, the president is calling for the military to be used as a way to subside and destroy communities. The reason why they're using the Custom Border Patrol to come in, as well as another carceral force to come in and to do racial terror, is another reason why when we're talking about cannabis regulation, we do actually have to give a damn about what immigration allies say. And that is something that people don't talk about. So to your point, Harvey, when we talk about record sealing and expungement, we need to be doing that kind of policy work hand in hand with people that are doing work around immigration, because those things impact them in a different way. And we know that cannabis is the #4 reason why people are ripped from their families and put in cages and deported from this country because of marijuana charges. And so when we have conversations about social justice, we also must not cheapen what we mean. Legalizing cannabis will not legalize people of color. It will certainly not legalize Black people. And when we talk about reparations, do not insult people by creating this idea that giving people licenses is reparations. What we are doing is reparative justice. We are offering additional things forward for people when we talk about reparation. It's symbolic in nature, but let's not cheapen the work that we've seen. The war on drugs is an armed conflict against people that are poor, people that are trans, people against women, people that are Black, people that are Latinx, people that are indigenous in so many ways, be it through the lack of access to healthcare or housing, or be it through racial trauma through law enforcement. And so when we have the conversation about regulation, it's how do we expand the frame about what that actually means? And that we must actually disentangle regulation from commercialization, because commercialization is a violent, violent act that is not only creating the opportunities for people like Eric Garner to be killed, but also the way that people like John Boehner, who has spent his life criminalizing communities of color, is better suited and positioned to reap from the very real advocacy and risk that people have put on their line to regulate this system. And so when we have conversations about this particular moment, regulation must not leave room for criminalization in any way, be it through housing, be it through access to healthcare, be it through whatever industry that we put forward, that the conversation around regulation is as steeped in racial justice and economic justice as it is in autonomy, and that the autonomy is not about people having the rights to have access to be able to ingest a substance, but the autonomy is that people are able to walk down the street without having people call the cops on them, like Amy Cooper did Christian Cooper, or in the ways that people can be on tape with their knee on your neck for 9 minutes, and us not have the confidence that they will be held accountable and fired from their post. And so when we have this conversation about cannabis regulation, it's about cannabis and it's not about cannabis. And that the opportunity here in the United States and across the borders, across the countries, across the pond, is that recognizing that what we're trying to do is to remove the tools that has been used for anti-Black white supremacy globally, that Blackness is not something that is distinct to the US, that white supremacy is not something that is distinct to the US, but that it is something that is being weaponized across the country. And so I'm super grateful to be on this panel with Kojo, because it is people like Amani Robinson who called me out at the DPA conference last year that was like, listen, when you guys talk about race in the US, you actually have to broaden it to be a global conversation. So we don't want people across the pond or across the border to look at the US and see our social equity. I actually think that it's most important for us to actually work on it together. We may have different regulation schemes that we have to navigate through, but the things that we're fighting are the same. And so I'm just gonna stop there.
Thank you so much for that, Kassandra. And such important points that you're making there. And in terms of how we frame the issue in its entirety and not just take it out as like an abstracted from all of those contexts and all of those issues. I think that's really important. So Shaleen, if we could go to you next, if you could talk to your kind of experiences on the regulation side, and just let's hear from you. Let's hear from you next. So thank you. Let's go to Shaleen.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I have a few points that I want to touch on that I think are universal, regardless of the circumstances that we face at any time. And that is that this entire effort for equity has been movement-led this entire time and needs to remain movement-led, that it requires coordination at all levels among government, which is the biggest lesson that I've learned in my position in Massachusetts, and that we need to focus on data collection of all of these different innovative methods that we're trying across the United States and that other countries, I hope, will soon be trying, so that we can learn from each other and have data to decide what to do next and what has been most impactful. So this being movement-led, I have to pause and acknowledge what it means to me to be discussing this on a panel with Transform and Drug Policy Alliance at this time, because when I was starting out as an activist almost 20 years ago, Transform was the only organization that was looking past legalization to what regulation should look like and what the principles of regulation should be in terms of how we make decisions and how we treat public health and how we treat different people. And that foundation has helped me for the past 20 years, and it serves me every day as a regulator. And then the Drug Policy Alliance, as Kassandra said, the reason that legalization has become real is because of the vision that people had for how it could be used for equality. And that is because of the Drug Policy Alliance's work. And Kassandra in particular, ever since she began, every time she speaks, it makes me realize that I need to completely rethink whatever I'm doing at that moment. And so between Transform and Drug Policy Alliance and Kassandra in particular, it informs every decision. And I really am looking forward to seeing what happens in the UK. I had the privilege of going there in 2019 and meeting with several different community activist groups. I think it will be movement-led there as well. And it's wonderful to see this report. I can vouch for how much characteristic effort and detail went into the examination of all the equity programs in the United States. And I think you've done a really great job and provided a service to your members and constituents to be able to learn from the lessons that we have learned in the United States so far. So in terms of it being movement-led here, probably every month or two, the same movement that led the legalization effort in Massachusetts will have another demand or another pressure campaign or another way of affecting our decision-making at our agency, because you're really swimming against a current when you are trying to be equitable, especially when it comes to the regulation of a drug that people still see as dangerous, that is still surrounded by stigma, and where the natural way of things is to restrict it as much as possible and make the barriers to entry as much as possible. And so when I said that the biggest lesson that I've learned is coordination at all levels, it's because what we learned in Massachusetts is that we had a job at our agency, which is the administrative agency at the state level, the Cannabis Control Commission, to be equitable and to include communities that had been disproportionately harmed, as well as farmers and minority, women, and veteran-owned businesses. But what happened was, as each of those businesses tried to go through the application and licensing process, they needed to get permission at the local level from their city or town. And the city and town had the same discretion that they always have with businesses. And specifically, they had the ability to select which businesses they work with. And what we found was across Massachusetts, at worst, the decision-making process at the local level was corrupt to the point where we now have federal investigations looking into it. And at best, there were a couple of cities, including Boston, that have really led and made their own equity programs and made their own equity funds. But most have been dictated by unconscious biases and systems of privilege, where the companies that came in that were well-resourced, that had fancy PowerPoint presentations, that had the connections to the mayor or the city council, they were able to work their way through their process in such a way that this repeated itself hundreds of times throughout Massachusetts. And our equity program participants and economic empowerment, that's the name of our other program that was meant to give priority review, not to people from disproportionately harmed communities, but people who would actually economically empower those communities by hiring them, by being owners, and by giving back in other ways. We found that almost none of those businesses were able to get through the process because of the local process and because of with the federal status of cannabis being illegal, they couldn't get bank loans and they couldn't get access to capital. So we've been working with those huge systemic barriers, but nonetheless, being movement-led, and as Harvey noted, with our agency being obligated under the law to figure out a way to include these companies, we were forced to be innovative and we were allowed to be innovative. So I can tell you what we are implementing right now, which is something I don't believe any other state is implementing, which is that we set aside a certain type of license for these businesses, only for them, for 2 years. 2 years was sort of arbitrary. The more important question is this length of time. Will it meet the goals? So at the end of 2 years, if we find that we've met the goals where this particular type of license has led to equality and fairness and the inclusion of these communities, then we can open this type of license to everybody. If it doesn't, we will extend the period longer. So we've laid out that data collection and decision-making in our regulations. The type of license that I'm talking about turns out to be delivery. And we've made that decision over a year ago and kind of wondering how profitable a delivery license would be and waiting to see how much we could help by, for example, letting one business make its own craft products and then delivering them directly to the consumer, skipping over retail. That's something that we are going to offer and experiment and see how well it works. It turns out with the timing that the demand for delivery has never been higher because of COVID. And so our hope as we implement this, our application was just released last week to all social equity program participants throughout the state based on, as Harvey noted, past convictions or residents in a disproportionately impacted area. Will be able to monitor whether setting those licenses aside worked. We'll also be able to see those licenses as being for a different community and then perhaps treat it in different ways. For example, we can call the cities and towns directly and say, it's been a few years, you let a retail store into your town, you saw the sky didn't fall, you don't have children running around eating edibles, none of those things have happened. So now can we think about equality and what Massachusetts voters wanted, which was to make sure that Massachusetts residents benefit from this, and particularly those communities that were targeted by prohibition. That's what the voters said, that's what's in the law, and now I think we have a clear path to try. And if it doesn't work, then we'll try something else. That's been our attitude this whole time. So that's the point I said I would end on, which is data collection. I think Massachusetts has done by far the best job with data collection. We have every single equity program participant talking about what they feel worked in the program, what they feel didn't. We have the race and ethnicity and residence of every agent. in the marijuana business, every owner. And I would encourage anyone who is watching this to please take our data collection program and use it so we can be consistent. And we can watch, and I'm very excited to see what happens with Illinois. They're the only state that has managed to create a fund for loans and grants, which is huge. California has tried some innovative methods. There are some cities like Oakland that have tethered together the fates of general applicants with equity program participants, which is a smart way to help the equity program participants navigate what can be invisible barriers sometimes. And then we have states like Oklahoma that don't formally have an equity program, but they have treated marijuana businesses like any other business and largely gotten rid of the unfair stigma-based high barriers to entry. So I am very much looking forward to monitoring all of these programs, and then whatever we can see is working, we can replicate it, we can share it with you. And then I know that as you pay it forward and inform your legislators and the people that you are trying to pressure, that you'll be able to learn from all of these lessons. So again, thank you for all of your work, and thank you for having me on the panel.
Thank you so much, Shaleen. I mean, it's always fascinating to hear that, you know, how you can try and translate those principles into the detail and the nuts and bolts of actual regulation, legislation, how that's been working. So hopefully we'll be able to come back to that again in the discussion. So thank you again, Shaleen. Kojo, if we could go over to you now to speak from your perspective on these issues. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for having me here, James, and everybody at Transform, and thank you to Kassandra and Shaleen for, you know, such fantastic and wide-ranging presentations, covering the kind of the deep theory and the deep relationship between race and drugs that underpins this, as well as the logistical and practical implementation of actual regulation. And so I'm going to try and like do a little bit of bridging between those two, and a relocation specifically to the United Kingdom, and talk about these issues in relationship to the United Kingdom's relationship to the United States on both first race and then on actual cannabis regulation. You know, like Kassandra said, talking about these issues at this particular time, you know, it wouldn't be right to not really situate them and to anchor them in the reality of what's going on, you know, in the streets of the United States of America, and in terms of the solidarity actions that are taking place all across the world as well. You know, we're seeing a real visceral example of the racialized terror in relationship to policing that Black people face, not just in the United States of America, but in Brazil, but in Colombia, but in South Africa, and even in the United Kingdom itself. I think with a lot of the media reporting around the murder of George Floyd and the responses to them, you can see that there's sometimes a quite insidious sleight of hand that's performed by the British media, where there is a solidarity towards the sufferings of African Americans, but at the same time an erasure of the way these things might manifest themselves in the United Kingdom. You know, an idea of like, oh, it's terrible what's going on over there. You know, aren't we so fortunate that we don't have these same issues over here? And whilst, you know, I've spent time living and working in the criminal justice system in the South of the United States. So whilst we don't have, you know, policemen with AR-15s on the streets, thank God, you know, whilst we don't have an institution comparable to, you know, Angola prison, where I was doing some work, you know, former slave plantation that maintains its name, you know, we do have an issue of perhaps burying and hiding those moments of racial confrontation and the role that policing plays in the maintenance of racial oppression here in the United Kingdom. You know, people will be a lot more familiar with the names, even in Britain, be a lot more familiar with the names of Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin than they would do with Sheku Bayu or Jimmy Mabenga or Sarah Reid. And, you know, we have a huge amount of people who've died following police custodies. So whilst not being shot, but, you know, whilst being in police stations, whilst being under arrest. And we haven't had a conviction since 1969 of a policeman being responsible for the death of someone in their custody. And we also have a major issue when it comes to over imprisonment and over policing of particularly the Black communities here in the United Kingdom. It might surprise a lot of people. I don't know if we have any listeners joining us from the US today to know that in the UK, we actually have a higher rate of the Black population in the United Kingdom currently imprisoned than in the United States of America. So whilst not a larger overall number, a larger percentage of the numbers that are actually part of the population. And so, you know, this imprisonment rate and this racialized criminal justice system, you know, is heavily interwoven with the realities of drug policing here in the United Kingdom. In terms of stop and search, which is of course, as the work by people like Stopwatch and Release have made so evident, the disproportionality of its implementation on Black populations is pretty drastic. And of the disproportionality, the most common reason, the most common ground that's provided by the police for the for actually stop and searching local people is suspicion of having drugs upon them. And so there is a concrete example of how the architecture of drug policing allows for the very real racialized discrimination that leads to over-imprisonment, that leads to potentially deaths following police custody. And so when we are thinking about trying to transform or reform the laws around drug policing, we have to start at that very position. We have to start at what has been the material impact of drug policing and how can we undo that through regulation and reform. And I think to take something Kassandra said as well, what she mentioned about how, you know, we can't have regulation simply be commercialization, because commercialization is violence. You know, I think that that's something that we can really speak to here when we think about the United Kingdom and its relationship with the idea of legally regulated drugs trade, because there was a history prior to Prohibition, and that's something I think we often forget. And the United Kingdom played a specific role in that, in terms of facilitating the trade of drugs that are now universally prohibited by international law all around the world as part of the British Empire. The most notable example of this would, of course, be the Opium Wars facilitated by the East India Company into the Qing dynasty of China in order to ensure that they received opium that was being grown and produced in the British Empire. And so if we go back, you know, a little over 100 years ago, the commercialized trade of legal drugs is something that is both violent, murderous, and is something that is incredibly profitable for what is still considered by some historians the largest ever multinational company that was the East India Company. And so, you know, this is what we want to ensure does not happen when we turn the page on perhaps the prohibitive war on drugs. But it's something that starts to be pushed for when we look at who are some of the organizations that are pushing for cannabis legalization here in the United Kingdom. Of course, there's the, you know, this is the wonderful work being done by Transform and Release. And, you know, I remember, similar to what Shaleen said when I first started as a lawyer with Release, going to the Transform How to Regulate Cannabis presentation and really having my eyes opened as to how we can go beyond the current system of prohibition that we exist in. But being joined in that space with Transform and Release and other drug policy organizations are institutions of a particular economic orientation, like the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, City AM, institutions that are very much tied to a history of free marketeerism and a hypercapitalization. And so if that is the way in which legal regulation is framed here in the United Kingdom, you know, it's not going to have space for a lot of those really exciting social equity programs that are being experimented with within the United States, or that have been mapped out by the presentation that Harvey presented with us at the start of this particular webinar. And so I think that, you know, we need to really try and ensure that as regulation does start to come to the United Kingdom, and I think I think most people from across the political spectrum see it as something that is going to come, as a question of when, not a question of if. But we need to make sure that when it does arrive, that there is the thinking and the organization in terms of those ensuring, those committed to ensuring the regulation is both racial and socially just. They need to be prepared in order to enter into that debate, in order to frame the legislation, in order so that it can address some of those harms that we mapped out right at the beginning of this whole session. You know, I think that takes a lot of work. So we of course need the kind of the drug policy organizations to take seriously these questions of racial and social equity, as a Transform have done today. But we also need to make sure that it's not just a drug policy kind of insular conversation, but it's one that's connected to community groups and, you know, to kind of anti-racist organization, you know, the kind of organizations that are leading the solidarity responses to the racialized violence that's going on in the United States at the moment. You know, and I know that's not always easy, you know, coming from, you know, a conservative, you know, African, church-going, you know, a community. I think it took my mum like 2 years to tell her friends what I was doing my PhD on. You know, there's a conversation that needs to be had both sides. Then, you know, there needs to be the education of the drug policy kind of community on questions of racial justice and the history of, you know, anti-racist struggle and, you know, Black struggle against police violence that happened very much here in the UK, not just in places like the United States and South Africa. But then there also needs to be that conversation and that education in terms of, you know, Black and Afro-Caribbean communities here in the United Kingdom about how drugs policing and the ideology in drugs has very real material consequences for the communities that they live, that are connected to people having their, you know, not only their freedom taken away in terms of being arrested, but in terms of not being able to access education, in terms of compromising their access to their children and custody arrangements, and all those kinds of things can be really impacted by the disproportionate levels of drug conviction. And so hopefully if we can facilitate that conversation here in the United Kingdom and learn the lessons from our colleagues over there in the United States and elsewhere, we'll be in a good position to enter into the argument when drug regulation does become a priority here in the UK.
Thank you so much, Kojo. Again, I think such important points around the values, I suppose, which we're foregrounding and the values which we are attempting to achieve, you know, and the outcomes we're attempting to achieve through, you know, it goes back to Cassandra's point, I think, earlier on as well, you know, what is drug policy reform for? It's not for it's an end in its own right? It's a way of achieving wider social goals and trying to identify what those are and specify what those are, I think is so important. Okay, what I'm going to do now is get everyone involved in the general discussion. We have questions from the floor, as it were, which I'll try and put to you. We've got, first of all, we've got a few questions actually, which I'll try and group a little bit, which goes back to this point, you know, this kind of striking phrase that's been used about commercialization as violence. You know, the question being, well, I suppose twofold. One is, you know, how do we in the drug policy reform movement negotiate with or think about the role of commercialization in a regulatory environment? And secondarily, I suppose, what are, or do you have any thoughts on what the other models that are out there, whether, you know, someone on one of the questions has mentioned a kind of state monopoly model which applies to alcohol in a number of states in Canada, in a number of provinces, sorry, in Canada and in other places around the world, as a alternative to a kind of open commercial approach, or the kind of a social clubs model, or are there ways, I mean, it's kind of like taming the tiger, right? Is it possible to tame the tiger, as it were, or is it not? And I'd just be interested to see, you know, what your kind of further thoughts on that may be. I mean, whoever wants to kind of start with any thoughts on that. Cassandra, I'm going to throw you on there. I'll point to people.
So I think that we have to have a conversation. I think someone talked about the Spanish cannabis clubs in the Q&A, and I think one of the things that we're exploring in New York are worker cooperatives as an alternative to just big brick and mortar stores. And, you know, I think in the US, I think the conversation is commercialization is our big game. It's like our big thing. But I think for us, I think it's a false choice. I think it's more important for drug policy to show that we have multiple ways as opposed to conceding that commercialization is the only way, right? And so how are we having conversations with people along the spectrum to talk about how multiple models are able to be generated in the space, and how do we take out the exploitative things that will further criminalize the groups of people that we're trying to protect and trying to stand with as we move forward. And so that's my biggest thing. And I don't know if Kojo and Shaleen would like to add to that.
Shaleen, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Dr. Koram laid out really well what we are trying to avoid here in terms of hyper commercialization. And I love what Kassandra said about commercialization being a violent act. I've never heard anyone say that before, but it's so true in what we're trying to prevent. And you saw in the sidebar, the article from the Boston Globe that shows how companies have tried to get around the limits in Massachusetts. We have a three license limit, and the ways that they've tried to test that, anything that we try, they will take advantage of, and we have to be aware of that, or they'll try to take advantage of. But one example I want to give of how the movement won in Massachusetts is last year, there was a push to create a task force that would crack down on illicit suppliers of marijuana. And it was meant to be gentle, like the title of the bill was that it would be civil penalties only. But if you read the bill carefully, it said that they were creating a task force and they could essentially do whatever they wanted. And it was extremely powerful forces that had gotten together to push this bill. It was prohibitionists, police, and big marijuana companies that were all lobbying for it. And what we saw was essentially the same people, Black and Latino people in particular, who were supposed to benefit from our law, and the data shows they hadn't benefited and the state hadn't met its obligations. They protested the bill, and they were absolutely correct in saying there's no way that you can pass this and try and imagine that you need to crack down on these communities as though they could just shift to the legal market, when of course they cannot. And really, you're just perpetuating the same thing and continuing the drug war if you're now going to have a crackdown task force while giving the industry away to these other companies. And they won. The bill died. It didn't even get out of committee. And those are very, very powerful forces.
Yeah, Kojo, have you got any thoughts there?
I mean, just to add on to that, I think that, you know, when we're trying to envision what potential other models we might be able to explore, you know, I think there's a lot of positives that have emerged from, you know, the Spanish Cannabis Club's example. And, you know, obviously I know there's some commercialization bleeding into that, but there's also been real examples of kind of, more cooperative models of being able to not only consume cannabis, but also to grow and produce it as well. And I think that leads us on to thinking about, you know, how do we try and ensure there's this social equity model in terms of cannabis as a global commodity. You know, we want to be thinking about not only the communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs in places like the United Kingdom and the United States. You know, what in kind of old drug policy talk used to be known as the kind of consumer countries, but also in what we used to call the supply countries, in terms of who's been disproportionately impacted in the places where cannabis was traditionally grown, produced, and smuggled from. You know, when we think about the areas within Mexico, when we think about the new areas of cannabis potential production that are being explored often by ambitious venture capitalists in places like sub-Saharan Africa, in Madagascar and Uganda. And so we want to ensure that whatever model that we draw up doesn't allow for the re-implementation of inequitable global trading practices, because people who will be familiar with, you know, other global legal commodities, whether that be gold, whether that be diamonds, whether that be oil, will be well aware that, you know, things don't have to be illegal for people of the global south and people of color to have their lives devastated by the trade of it. And so we want to make sure cannabis doesn't become the latest version of that.
Yeah, I mean, that goes on to actually a question that has come up in the Q&A as well, which is how can we, I mean, it's a really important point that you know, this is a global question, and we have to be thinking about the impacts on producer companies. And if you look at, you know, we've all seen what's happened with, you know, a lot of the big Canadian companies, particularly the way they've been operating around the globe around production. I mean, has anyone got any thoughts on, I mean, just the question of how we can actually involve people from those countries that have been impacted in their own way by the war on drugs, and who don't necessarily stand to win if the consequence of legal regulation for them is that they simply then become the target of, you know, corporate producers who just want to kind of land on that, you know, where they are and start to use their labour to produce the product that they are then selling elsewhere. Have you got direct thoughts on how we can get that kind of global conversation going? Or I mean, it's existing, but how we can better develop it? Anyone want to go on that one? Is that you, Kassandra?
No, that's me saying I don't want to go.
We'll say that as the signal for no, and that can be the signal for yes. I mean, I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts, but I mean, it is an important question, I think.
Well, I mean, I guess one of the first things that we have to do in order to maybe even really begin to try and implement those kind of global fair trade practices within cannabis is to confront the international legislation on cannabis. And so we'd probably be looking to try and, first of all, use the forum of the United Nations to think about cannabis's location within the Civil Convention on Narcotic Drugs 1961, and shift it from something that's currently prohibited by international law and move it into arenas where, you know, it's being discussed as part of, you know, the kind of, you know, first country privileges of the WTO, and those kinds of forums where we can think about, well, what is the consequences of Canada opening up huge, you know, airport size hangars of marijuana production and placing a kind of an import ban on the legal, you know, cannabis sphere. Is that something that would even be allowed, and should that be allowed by international law? But that can only be discussed once I think we've dealt with the current criminalization of of the drugs trade.
And I'll say, as the non-lawyer, because the lawyers love to go to the international law, I think that we have enough conferences as a movement that we see each other enough that we should use them as working spaces. How do we take advantage of the fact that people are going to the different drug policy conferences and not just use them as a way for us to build the brand of our organizations and exchange information, but actually use them as an organizing space? These marijuana companies are meeting monthly. There is a conference all the time. The regulators are meeting regularly. The movement needs to actively be accountable to the things that we say the world deserves. We created the space for industry, so we must take responsibility for the space that our advocacy has created. And that means we need to actively address it. And so does that mean that Transform, MECD, HRI, Drug Policy Alliance, that we do quarterly meetings where we talk about, like actually talk about, what do we mean when we say this? If we're putting forward Transform has put out, we should regulate all drugs, right? And so like everyone's having these conversations, this is what regulation looks like. People are paying attention to us. We are not a fringe issue. In the United States, people have taken drug policy as the criminal justice issue. And like, if we end the drug war, we will end mass incarceration. We will not. It is a force multiplier, as Rashad Robinson has pushed me to see, right? From Color of Change, where the drug policy is not a silver bullet for people, right? And so we can't position it that way, and that we actually have to be in continuous active conversation within ourselves as a movement about what we are putting out, and then with other movements about what the things we're doing, how it impacts them. And how is the policy, there was a question here about when we're having the conversation about reparations, what reparations are owed to people in Mexico based on the violence that our drug use has fueled across the border. And that is an active conversation that advocates need to have, and that we actually, to Kojo's point, how do we use global strategy as a way to put forward what we think should be possible? Because the US is not more deserving of better drug policy than other countries, right? And so why shouldn't we be working together to build an active network to put forward the policies? And that can happen in international law or the United Nations, but we know how feckless those institutions can be. So why pretend? Why go through the pomp and circumstance where technology gives us the opportunity to sit together and to actually organize and to plan? Drug policy is not a theoretical exercise. It is literally a tool for us to save communities. And unless we are willing to just pretend that we will do reports and not actually put them in action, then we can keep doing these webinars, right? And we can keep publishing these reports. But unless we're going to actually take accountability for the ideas and the things we put out in the world, then then this is actually an exercise. And I'm not interested in that as a Black person that is literally governed by people's ideas of what is freedom. And so I think to this point, to Kojo's point, yeah, let's do the UN thing, but all the organizations that do international drug policy, we should all be having active conversation about what it means for what it means for us to put these ideas out, and how will we work together coordinated? How will we how can we coordinate to actually be responsible for what we're putting out and what we are selling people? Because the thing that's very clear is that we sold Black, Latinx, poor people, indigenous communities, this idea that legalization was going to be social justice. We sold that idea very effectively, and it didn't fucking work. It didn't work in the way that we promised. It is not to the scale that we need. And unless we are willing to be honest about that and be accountable to that and do something different about the way that we build, then there will continue to be racial terror in the street, and police officers will feel like it is okay to put their knees on the necks of people all over and look at people and say, the reason why their foot is on their neck is because they shouldn't use drugs, and that they'll continue to use drug toxicology reports to smear them, or they will continue to create drug raids as a reason to shoot people in their beds like they did Breonna Taylor, or they will continue to use drugs as a reason to criminalize and sexually assault trans women because they use drugs. So I'm like, there's no need for us to create all this other stuff. We can have, as long as we can have this conversation across the pond, we can have a conversation about being accountable for the things that we are telling people justice is.
Yeah, Shaleen.
Yes, and a couple points to add to that that's related. I think this is worth saying out loud. One thing that we're seeing play out across the United States is that it's easier to stop something from happening than to make it happen. And we are seeing a lot of states where people, Black and brown people, are saying, you're not going to use us to pass a bill that is essentially paying lip service to these concepts. And it has, I think, rightfully held up the process of passing legalization in a lot of places. And that's how it should be. And it's something to keep in mind. And I had another thing I wanted to say. Oh, one other thing. At drug conferences, I have met people like Catherine Lederber, who works with Bolivian farmers, people from Mexico who are organizing farmers and have had pilot programs for different drugs. I think that to the original question of how can we get people who are already involved centered in regulation, I think actually the US is a very bad example of that, because the regulators and the actual people in practice are so far away. And to the extent that we have tried to include, say, co-ops who were already growing cannabis, or delivery businesses, and tried to make our regulations fit what they are doing, we should have started with them and built the regulations around them. But instead, we have all of these crazy things like, you know, you have to go get a contract, you have to go get insurance that you can't get, you have to build a secure wall that you can't possibly build on a farm. And the list just goes on and on of trying to like shoehorn these things to fit the people who should have been in the center from the begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I that point, you know, about, and it's a lesson, right? And it's a learning process, and there's a lot of learning happening very, very quickly, I guess. And I suppose that kind of point about realize or recognizing what the principles are and what the practicalities are that need to be there right from the start, that need to be like embedded in the advocacy and in the design of the proposed models and in the implementation of them. Because as you say, you know, once the system's in place, you know, and it starts to be kind of populated, it's much, much harder to then retroactively kind of, you know, make it work in the ways that we want it to work. And I suppose this is an opportunity for us all to be thinking, what going forward do we need to make sure is absolutely there at the foundation, absolutely there kind of as a core running through what we're trying to achieve, and how do we articulate that, and how do we share that, and how do we work together on that to make sure that going forward, you know, that's not something that's on the edge and then is plugged in later, because I think that's where you just, you know, it's just so hard to do that. We've had lots and lots of questions, but I'm conscious that we're running over time already. I don't know if there's any. I feel bad. There's lots of questions that we're not being able to answer. That, I mean, I don't know if you want to kind of make any final points, or whether you're willing to take one more question, or whether you'd like to. We could send you that. We can all just share the questions as well and just kind of think about them and help them to use them to inform our thinking. I don't know. How do you feel, the panelists, about? Do you want to go one more, or should we? Or do you want to kind of wrap up? And I'll give you a chance to say some final points. I think maybe that's an unfair question. You've been here for a long time, been here for more than an hour, and I think possibly putting in a situation again, should we take one or two or three more? I think what we better do is wrap it up there anyway. But just to say, the people who did ask questions, what I think we'll try and do is kind of gather those at least and circulate them so that we can all see the kind of questions that people are asking, and we can ask them of ourselves, and we can maybe discuss them and feed them into what we're doing. I want to thank the everyone for attending, and the panelists for their incredible contributions here. It's been absolutely fantastic. I want to make sure, I'm trying to find things on, yeah, I want to make sure, ask everyone who's attended if they can make sure that they do fill in the survey. I hate all that. Can you fill in the survey at the end? But you know, it's one of those things you have to do, but it's very useful actually. It's very useful for us because we've not done this before. We want to make sure that we get it right. Again, learning as we go forward, but also to you know, encourage people who are watching and who are taking part to you know, if you're not already active, and if you do feel that change needs to happen, and if you do feel that change needs to be done properly, then to be heard and to get involved and to, you know, go onto our website, the GPA's website, or to, you know, the websites of Release and the other organisations that are working in this space. We're putting links onto the chat channel for how you can get involved with us through maybe our Anyone's Child campaign. There's a day of action on June 26th, Support Don't Punish, Global Day of Action. Go onto that website, check that out, get involved in that. Write to your elected representatives. Get involved in any way you can, because I think this is one of those subjects where there's a lot of people who would, if will say, yeah, it's terrible, it's really bad, we need to do something, but we need to do something if we're going to do something. And I think that's where and so please do get involved in all that. Go onto our website, download our report, and we've also got another webinar next Tuesday, which is based on a report which is looking at Canada, which is actually going to focus a little more on the issues of corporate caption and those particular questions. So we'll be revisiting some of these questions again, and maybe some of the questions that have been asked here can be answered there too. I think that's everything. Harvey, is there anything else that you want to add before we go?
No, just to say thank you to all our panel. That great discussion. It was wonderful to listen to those comments. Really inspiring. Yeah, our report's available on the website, and MUCD, our partner in Mexico, they've got a companion report in Spanish, which they've also on regulation in the US, which is also online now.
Yeah, do check that out. That's MUCD have been doing some great work around this as well. Do any of the panelists want to say any final things before we wrap up?
Just thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Kassandra and Shaleen, for their contributions, and thank you to Transform for, I think, writing this really urgent engagement with the different models of regulation, particularly thinking about, what is coming down the pipe here in terms of the United Kingdom. I think I saw in one of the comments, a really highlight on this, on the kind of condition of emergency that surrounds the drugs trade, drugs policing, drugs deaths in the United Kingdom, with the highest drug deaths in Europe. The idea of drug policy reform is something that really has to be taken seriously. The idea of racial justice really has to be taken seriously, and thinking about them together is some really important work. So thank you, Transform, and thank you, Harvey.
Thank you, everybody, so much for taking part. Thank you for attending. I really look forward to speaking to you all again soon. And have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all soon. Thank you very much. Okay, bye, everyone.